Okay, so the question we're going to ask today is, does the process by which the Constitution is amended do more harm than good? So what we're going to start with doing in this question is considering what is meant by harm and what is meant by good. So remembering the question, is it doing more harm than good? But hang on, what does harm actually mean and what does good actually mean in this context? So let's think about what the founding fathers were trying to achieve. What is the purpose of that very difficult amendment process? And then thinking, what is the harm that this might be doing? So the difficulty in amending the Constitution, what's the harm it might be doing? And obviously as well thinking, well, hang on, what's the good? What's the good nature of this difficult amendment process? So the good that it's doing is that it prevents a tyrant or a dictator assuming power and then amending that constitution as they saw fit. That was the key aim of the founding fathers. They did not want a dictator assuming power and then making huge amendments to the constitution. On the flip of that, bad, so the harm that the difficult amendment process is doing, is that it makes change very difficult to occur. And moreover, on top of that, it puts too much power into the hands of a minority, and that can thereby weaken the premise of democracy in which all are equal. What I want to add, though, is that if we're evaluating these two arguments, ultimately the amendment process is a force for good, because the worst thing that can happen, a dictatorship, is actually profoundly more dangerous for America than the lack of a pure democracy, and that's particularly the case when the democratic, will of the people is so often against the interests of the minority, and it's the minority who need protecting the most. So, in summary, is the difficult amendment process doing more harm than good? I would answer it's doing more good than it is doing harm. So the first point I want to make in this essay is that the difficult amendment process is actually a really good thing because it prevents the tyranny of the majority. Now, this is really important because in a democracy, the minority is always at risk, and therefore the founding fathers were very keen to prioritise the safety of those minority groups. Now, what we might see is that if the amendment process was easier and required just a very simple, say, straightforward 51% agreement, then these certain groups would have their beliefs and their needs and their cultural understandings and instincts threatened quite dramatically. I think it would be conceivable to say that if the amendment process was easier, then what you might find is like kind of the more liberal population centres around the east and the west coast would dominate thinking, and that would put in jeopardy the cultural practices of those people in the more sparsely populated areas in the old Midwest. So, for example, if I look at the map below here, you can see the kind of darker blue. That's where we've got the largest number of people, and they're obviously dotted around the kind of coastal areas on the east and the west coast. And then you get the kind of really light shaded, very light blue colours in the middle. Those people would just have their kind of cultural lives and practices completely trampled all over. And I think it's important, or at least the founding fathers thought it's important that all people were respected and that it didn't matter the size of the state, that everyone had to be respected as an equal. Now, on the flip of that, one of the key things to argue here is that it actually gives too much power to a real small number, and particularly to a real small number of states. So what I'm going to do is focus on one real core example of this. So in 1972, there was a real clamour for the passage of something called the Equal Rights Amendment, which would give women equality in the workplace. Now, that Equal Rights Amendment passed both the Senate and the House of Representatives easily. They got over 80% voting in favour of the Equal Rights Amendment in both of those two houses. You then get a process to which the states had 7 years to ratify that amendment. And 35 of the 50 states did so, and did so pretty quickly. Now, what was weird here or strange was that 15 states didn't ratify it. But the 35 states that did so made up about 35% of, sorry, I'll say that again, made up about 70% of the US population. So what we have here is we've got both houses of Congress voting by 80% margins to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. We then had 35 of the 50 states giving their approval to put it into the Constitution. Then they encompassing about 70% of the US population. And yet, it didn't make it into the Constitution because this really small number of states stopped that from happening. Now, this poses some real question about democracy here and how a very small minority, and this, we can flip it because we can call it the tyranny of the minority. And here, how the tyranny of the minority is preventing change from taking place. So what we're going to do now is we want to move on to the kind of evaluation stage of our paragraph. And remember what we're evaluating here is we've got one argument which says that the tyranny of the majority needs to be protected against at all costs. And then on the other side, well, hang on, but we're now getting tyranny of the minority and this small minority are blocking change. What I want to think about is on balance. Okay, so on balance, I think it's better that a minority of states can block the amendments. The founding fathers of the Constitution, they really wanted to ensure that individual states were free to be culturally unique from one another, and that United States of America would respect this. Now, the difficult amendment process therefore protects this really important element of the Constitution, the right of the states, no matter how small, to have a role in the governing the country as a whole. So I think on balance of the two arguments, we really want to prioritize the protection of the small states. Now, a second point to make is that actually the really difficult amendment process just isn't a problem. And that's because we've got the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has consistently done the job of updating that Constitution over time. Now, a really good quotation to use here is that by the former Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes. Now, he famously remarked, "We are under a Constitution. The Constitution is what the judges say it is." And so, therefore, the fear that this amendment process might leave the USA behind the times and unable to adapt to new ideas and customs, and this is dispelled by that sentiment. Now, let's take a really simple example of this. So, in 2015, the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage, or at least said that gay marriage was constitutional. And this was in the Obergefell versus Hodges case. Now, in determining that the Constitution did give the right to individuals to have a gay marriage, this meant that there was no need to create any sort of constitutional amendment. So again, we don't need an amendment process, and it doesn't matter that the amendment process is difficult because the Supreme Court just keep on doing the job of updating the Constitution and its meaning anyway. Now, despite this, it is really problematic that constitutional rights are now effectively in the hands of 9 Supreme Court justices. And to make matters worse, these 9 Supreme Court justices are unaccountable for the decisions that they're taking. It would be much better if decisions are taken by politicians who are then accountable to the people at elections. Now, a second problem posed by forcing the Supreme Court to update the Constitution is that the Supreme Court justices can change their mind over time. Now, it's important to remember here that if these changes were inserted as an amendment, they would be so much more difficult, to replace them and to change them or remove them. But in the current situation, the Supreme Court justices can easily go against the precedent that they had set in an earlier case. So let's now have a think about an example of that. So in 1972, we've got Roe versus Wade, and that says that abortion is a constitutional right. So the Supreme Court justices say, no, abortion is fine up to 24 weeks. It's a constitutional right for a woman to do that. Now, forward 40 years, and Justice Jackson says that, well, actually, no, hang on. We've looked at the Constitution again, and we don't think abortion is a constitutional right. And so the real point to make here is that if that amendment if abortion rights were an actual amendment in the Constitution, it'd be so much more harder to remove. And so by giving the Supreme Court justices this power, this influence, you're really opening up a really difficult scenario in which rights can be taken away as easy as they can be awarded. I want to think about how we're going to evaluate this. Now, on the one side, you've got obviously the suggestion that, well, the difficult amendment process isn't actually a problem, because the Supreme Court does that job of updating the Constitution. On the other hand, we're going to ask, well, hang on, this is kind of politically dangerous that you've got 9 unaccountable and unelected individuals making these really totemic decisions. So we want to kind of weigh those two things up against one another. Now, it's interesting that one of the ways that the Supreme Court look at it, and famously, former Justice Antonin Scalia once said, you want the right to an abortion, create it the way that all rights are created in a democracy, pass a law. The death penalty, pass a law. Now, Scalia here was actually really talking about kind of how he would interpret the Constitution and how he would look at what the original meanings of the Constitution are. And, for him, he says, well, the Constitution doesn't mention abortion. So really, it shouldn't be up to the Supreme Court. It should be up to the people to add an amendment to the Constitution if that is what they want. Now, and this is a really interesting point by Scalia, but it doesn't really acknowledge how difficult the amendment process is, and moreover, the fact that the amendment process is not actually democratic. It's not like passing a normal law where you need a 50% majority. To get an amendment to protect abortion or to protect gay marriage, you'd need to get a supermajority of kind of 66%, and then your 38 states on top of that as well. So this becomes really, really difficult. And what I would then argue is that the amendment process needs to be more democratic to reduce the influence the Supreme Court has. And therefore, actually, this would be a scenario in which the amendment process is doing more harm than good. It is not democratic, and it is forcing unelected justices to make key decisions, which is undemocratic because they are unaccountable and they are unelected. So the final point I'd make here, which would suggest that the amendment process has done more good than it has done harm, is that it has prevented short-termism and prevented the creation of amendments that suit a kind of populist mood. So one of the examples I'd like to focus on here first off is that following the 9/11 attacks in 2001, many countries across the world passed laws that removed the fundamental rights of citizens. More often than not, those affected minority groups. So, for example, in Britain, the Blair government passed something called the Anti-Terrorism Crime and Security Act, and that allowed for the detention of individuals who were suspected of terrorism. Now, given the hysteria that took place following 9/11, most of those individuals detained were from minority groups, predominantly Muslim groups. Now, obviously, the beauty of the difficult amendment process is that it made something like this so much more difficult in the United States, and they could never take away the fundamental rights which have been enshrined in the Bill of Rights. So this really difficult process is actually a very, very good thing. Now, a second example would be the Flag Desecration Amendment, which has been something that was really popular in the 1990s to the mid-2000s. Now, it followed the case of Texas versus Johnson in 1990, whereby the Supreme Court determined that burning the flag was fine, it was constitutional, and it was an act of free speech. Now, following the case, what you get kind of hysteria and anger amongst many lawmakers and legislators who think it's absolutely horrific that you're allowed to burn the American flag. So what we then see is, you get all this support for the Flag Desecration Amendment, and we see in every Congress between 1995 and 2005, we see attempts to insert a Flag Desecration Amendment into the Constitution. Now, in most given scenarios, that would have been accepted, but because of the really difficult amendment process, that short-termism was never bowed to, and they failed in each attempt to insert this Flag Desecration Amendment because they needed a supermajority to do so. So this short-term populist thinking, is a reaction to this one Supreme Court judgment that says that burning the flag is a constitutional right, and they have jumped on that really quickly. But the difficult amendment process has meant that this couldn't take place, and they would not put it into the Constitution. So on the one hand, what you've got is that the Constitution, or at least the difficult amendment process, is a really good thing because it prevents some short-term thinking. But at the same point, the downside of this is it also means that the United States is so much slower to adapt to changing circumstances. Now, the example I would give of this would be of the Second Amendment's right to bear arms. Look, when the founding fathers are writing the Constitution, they don't for a second know what firearms are going to become. They don't know that guns can fire 100 bullets a minute. They've got no idea how things are going to change. They don't know they're going to be used in these mass school shootings, for example. Now, why that's problematic particularly is because it means that tough decisions can't be taken by governments with a mandate for change. So if we just compare this to the UK, for example, in the UK where there's no written constitution and there's no entrenchment process, so the amendments can be made really easily. A government can take a tough decision, that are politically unpopular, and then they'll hope that the electorate has forgotten about them by the time of the next election. The British government can just, with the majority they've got, they can easily just take these really tough decisions and make change happen. But in the United States, because of the written constitution, because of the entrenchment and this tough process by which we amend the constitution, it becomes so much more difficult to adapt to change and to these changing circumstances. Now, it would be worth saying here, particularly, that one of the problems is it gives too much power to those who wish to oppose change. They are every step of the way, with the supermajorities needed, they are able to oppose change and prevent kind of the United States organically moving forward and thinking in the more longer term interests of their population. So I think that kind of brings us to the end of thinking about how we would answer this question. As I've said, I think the amendment process it probably does do more good than harm, because even the slow pace of change and the prevention of longer term thinking, those are issues which actually can be overcome mainly through the Supreme Court. They'll quite often they're not update the Constitution as they go along. But I think that the key argument to make here is that the constitutional amendment process is problematic, but in the end, it does more good than it does harm. It prevents dictatorship, it prevents short-termism, it prevents the minority, and that was really always at the forefront of the founding fathers' minds.